Today, we're diving into one of the American Revolution's most brilliant generals, who might also have been its greatest traitor. His name was Charles Lee, and his story, well, it's a tangled web of ambition, rivalry, and a shocking betrayal that stayed buried for nearly 100 years.
So to really get what's going on here, you have to understand who Charles Lee was. This guy wasn't just another officer. He was appointed Major General back in 1775, and he was, without a doubt, the most experienced professional soldier in the entire Continental Army. He was, for all intents and purposes, George Washington's number 2.
And yet, his career ends with this absolutely damning verdict from his own side. After the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, a court-martial found him guilty of conducting an unnecessary, disorderly, and shameful retreat. For a soldier with his resume, this was a complete and utter catastrophe, a total fall from grace.
Which brings us to the big question, right? How did a general with a global military reputation, a man who was once a fiery advocate for American liberty, end up like this, disgraced? Well, the answer, as you're about to see, is way more complicated than just one bad day on the battlefield.
To really understand the man, you've got to look at his past. Lee's ambition, his whole persona really, was forged over decades of military service, long before anyone was even thinking about an American Revolution. Just take a look at this career. He buys his way into the British Army as a teenager, fights in North America during the 7 Years' War, serves as a major in Portugal, and was even an aide to the King of Poland. So when he shows up in America in 1773, his resume is just stacked. Nobody could really match it, especially not George Washington. And that right there, that's the absolute heart of the issue. In his own mind, Lee was the only choice to lead the Continental Army. So when Congress picks this Virginian planter, George Washington, instead, Lee was beyond insulted. He saw Washington as a total amateur, and that scorn, that contempt, it just festered. And it would end up defining their entire relationship. And of course, that personal resentment didn't stay personal for long. It quickly boiled over into his professional life, into outright insubordination. Lee started to see the war not just as a fight against the British, but as a fight for command against Washington himself. And let's be clear, Lee was not subtle about this. He was actively working to undermine his boss. He was writing letters to Congress, basically saying, hey, I should be in charge. He'd openly badmouth Washington's strategy to other officers. And then, most dangerously, during that desperate retreat across New Jersey in '76, he deliberately slow-walked his troops when Washington was begging for reinforcements.
But his arrogance finally caught up with him in, well, probably the most embarrassing way possible. In December of 1776, Lee was chilling at a tavern, a full 3 miles away from his army, when a British patrol rolls up and surprises him. He was captured, famously, in his dressing gown. Not a great look. So, Lee was eventually freed in a prisoner swap and returned to the army in 1778, just in time for the Battle of Monmouth. This was it. This was the moment that would define his entire career, and it all comes down to what actually happened on that battlefield. Everything, and I mean everything, hangs on this one question. Lee was convicted of disobeying orders. Okay, so what exactly were those orders? This is where it gets really interesting, because the actual written order, it just vanished. Luckily for us, we can piece together what the orders said from the court-martial testimony. The letter, penned by Washington's own aide, Alexander Hamilton, was delivered straight to Lee. And what's crucial here is that witnesses from both sides, Washington's staff and Lee's own staff, all agreed on what it said. Send a force to skirmish with and attack the British rearguard and coordinate with Colonel Morgan on the flank. The orders were pretty darn clear. Washington's instructions were to use some of the best troops for a brisk charge. So what does Lee do? He picks 2 of the weakest brigades he can find, full of brand new recruits. And instead of ordering an attack, he just sends out some militia to watch. He basically ignored both the letter and the spirit of his commander's plan. So when Washington rides onto the field and sees Lee's troops in a full-blown retreat, he is absolutely furious. After getting chewed out in front of everyone, a steaming mad General Lee writes this letter. He paints himself as the victim, demanding an apology from Washington for an act of cruel injustice. In his own head, he'd pulled off a brilliant tactical retreat that saved the army, and he actually demanded a court-martial to prove it. A huge, huge gamble.
Well, the court-martial did not go his way, but that's not where the story ends. Not even close. The real shocker, the evidence of a much, much deeper betrayal, that wouldn't come out for another 80 years.
So the court finds him guilty on all counts. But the sentence, a 1-year suspension, was honestly pretty light. So light that a lot of people, including Lee himself, kind of saw it as a partial win. Like maybe the first 2 charges were weak, and he was only really guilty of being disrespectful.
But while Lee was spending the rest of his life trying to clear his name, this treasonous document, written in his own hand, was just sitting in a box, hidden away in a British general's personal papers.
It wasn't until 1860, think about that, nearly a century after the battle, that the truth finally came out. A historian named George Moore was digging through the papers of the British commander, General William Howe, and he found something that just stopped him in his tracks.
It became known as the Lee Plan. While he was a prisoner in 1777, Lee had written a detailed military strategy for the British. It was a step-by-step guide on how they could crush the American rebellion. He even argued that with him captured, the Americans were doomed anyway. It was a stunning act of treachery, and it makes you wonder if his actions at Monmouth weren't just incompetence, but maybe intentional sabotage.
This discovery just changes everything. It forced historians to completely reevaluate the entire story of Charles Lee. Was he a misunderstood patriot, a political scapegoat, or was he flat out a traitor?
And you know what? The debate is still going on. George Moore, the guy who found a plan, saw him as a simple traitor who just lost his nerve. Decades later, historians like Theodore Thayer argued that no, Lee was a scapegoat for Washington, and his retreat at Monmouth was actually the right call. And more recently, a biographer named Philip Pappas has suggested Lee might have had bipolar disorder and that his wild behavior was really a product of his mental state. So we're left with this really complicated legacy. How should we remember Charles Lee? As one of the Revolution's earliest and loudest patriots? Or as the disgraced general who secretly drew up a plan for its destruction? Maybe the real answer is that he was all of those things. Brilliant, flawed, and in the end, a tragic figure who became a casualty of his own massive ambition.